Whatever was there was very intelligent.
At exactly 3:15 a.m. on November 13, 1974, a sleepy suburban home in Amityville, Long Island, became the scene of one of the most disturbing and perplexing crimes in American history. Ronald DeFeo Jr. moved from room to room with a rifle, executing his parents and 4 siblings as they slept.
Ronnie DeFeo had brutally murdered his entire family in this house.
Yet somehow, not a single neighbor heard a thing. Even more bizarre, none of the victims stirred. They were all found lying face down, as if something or someone kept them frozen in place. Weeks later, a new family moved in and fled in terror just 28 days later, claiming the house was possessed by something evil. Over the years, the story became legend. Books, films, and theories galore. But now, after 51 years, new evidence has come to light. And what it reveals changes everything.
If I'm not mistaken, they don't want to talk about.
Forget what you think you know about the Amityville horror. This is disturbing. Stay tuned as we uncover the truth behind this terrifying mystery. The murders at 112 Ocean Avenue. Amityville, Long Island, was the kind of coastal town where American dreams quietly settled. A sleepy village with trimmed hedges, family-owned diners, and children riding bicycles under oak trees. In the heart of this piece stood a large Dutch colonial house at 112 Ocean Avenue, a property that would soon earn a far darker reputation. What happened there in the early hours of November 13, 1974, would shatter the illusion of suburban safety forever. Ronald "Butch" DeFeo Jr. was 23 years old, living with his parents and 4 siblings in the 2.5-story house. From the outside, the DeFeos were a respectable, working-class Italian-American family. Ronald Sr. was a successful car dealership manager. Louise, a stay-at-home mother. But inside, tension brewed. Ronald Jr. was known to be troubled, described by neighbors and friends as angry, volatile, and increasingly erratic. He was heavily into drugs, heroin, LSD, and speed, and frequently fought with his authoritarian father. At times, the fights turned physical. Friends would later say they were shocked the killings didn't happen sooner. What remains most disturbing about that night is not only the brutal act itself, but the eerie, calculated calm with which it was carried out. At approximately 3 a.m., Butch retrieved a .35 caliber Marlin rifle, an incredibly loud hunting weapon, and moved quietly through the house. He first entered his parents' bedroom and fired 2 shots into each of them as they slept. His father, Ronald Sr., 43, was shot in the back and neck. Louise, 42, suffered 2 gunshot wounds, one of which tore through her lungs. Investigators revealed there was blood everywhere, but no sign of a struggle. They never woke up. Then Butch continued. He went to his brother's shared room. John Matthew, just 9 years old, and Mark, 11, were both shot once in the back. Again, there was no indication that they stirred. From there, he moved to his sister Allison's room. She was only 13. A single bullet to the head ended her life instantly. Then finally, he ascended to the top floor, where his eldest sister, Dawn, 18, slept. She too was shot in the head. Each of the 6 family members was found face down in their beds. None had fled. None had even moved. The positions of the bodies were hauntingly uniform, almost ritualistic. Forensics would later confirm that the shots occurred within roughly 15 minutes. 9 blasts from a rifle known for its explosive roar echoed through that house. Yet somehow, no one, not the victims, not the neighbors, heard a thing. The only reported sound during that hour was the barking of the family dog. How is that possible? To this day, no one can explain it with certainty. One theory posits that the victims were drugged, but toxicology reports found no sedatives in their systems. Another theory suggests multiple shooters. Others believe they were killed one by one so quickly that none had the chance to react. But that doesn't account for the absence of any defensive wounds or signs of panic. At approximately 6:30 p.m. that same day, Ronald Jr. entered Henry's bar just down the street and yelled, "You've got to help me! I think my mother and father are shot!" A group of locals followed him back to the house. Inside, they stumbled upon the blood-soaked nightmare. Within minutes, police were called, and investigators swarmed the scene. Ronald Jr. initially played the part of a grieving son. He claimed that a mob hitman named Louis Fellini had carried out the killings. He said he hadn't been home the previous night. He was angry about his mother's cooking, he said, and had stayed at a friend's house. But inconsistencies in his timeline began to surface. Investigators noted how calm and rehearsed he seemed. After 12 hours of questioning, he cracked. "Once I started," he reportedly said, "I just couldn't stop. It went so fast." He confessed to killing his family, citing years of physical and emotional abuse at the hands of his father and a deep resentment toward his siblings, whom he referred to as leeches and pigs. Yet even in his confession, the full picture never came together. He gave conflicting motives. In one version, he acted alone. In another, his sister Dawn helped. In yet another, he claimed to have heard voices commanding him to kill. Whatever the truth, Ronald DeFeo Jr. was charged with 6 counts of second-degree murder. During his trial, the defense attempted an insanity plea. Psychiatrists diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, but the jury didn't buy his stories. He was found guilty and sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms. He would die in prison in 2021, still insisting the full truth had never come out.
The convicted killer, whose 1974 murder spree spawned the Amityville horror franchise, has died while serving 25 years to life in prison.
But here's the strange part. The mystery didn't end with the murders. In fact, it had only just begun. Just 13 months later, a new family moved into the DeFeo house, and within 28 days they would flee in terror, leaving everything behind. What happened next would become one of the most infamous paranormal legends in American history. And as new revelations emerge, the truth behind it all is finally, shockingly, coming to light. The haunting that shocked the world. 13 months after the DeFeo murders, in December of 1975, the Lutz family moved into 112 Ocean Avenue. George and Kathy Lutz, along with Kathy's 3 children from a previous marriage, had purchased the house for $80,000, an incredible deal for a 5-bedroom, 3-bath waterfront property on Long Island's South Shore. They knew about the murders, of course. The real estate agent disclosed the grisly history, and they even discussed it together over dinner. But George and Kathy were not superstitious. They were looking for a fresh start. From the moment they moved in, strange things began to happen. Within hours, the family dog, Harry, chained in the backyard, attempted to leap over the fence and nearly hanged himself. George managed to rescue him just in time. Then came the odors, unexplainable stench in different rooms that would vanish as suddenly as they appeared. Doors creaked, cold spots formed in warm rooms, and then the noises. A family friend urged George to have the house blessed. George agreed. A Catholic priest, Father Ray Pecoraro, arrived to perform the ritual. But according to George, something went terribly wrong. As the priest sprinkled holy water in what had once been Don DeFeo's bedroom, he heard a voice, deep, disembodied, command him, "Get out!" He reportedly felt a force slap him across the face and fled the room. In the days that followed, he developed painful boils on his hands. Though George insisted this happened, Father Pecoraro later claimed under affidavit that he never actually entered the house, only spoke to George by phone. One of many contradictions that continue to cloud the truth of this story. Soon, Kathy began sensing a presence. A woman, she said, one who would occasionally wrap herself around her from behind, almost comfortingly. The house didn't feel hostile at first, just watchful. But their daughter, Missy, introduced the family to a new friend, a creature she called Jody. Jody, she said, was a pig with glowing red eyes who appeared outside her window at night and told her they would never leave the house. George and Kathy both claimed to see those red eyes staring in from the yard on a snowy December night. George ran outside, but no one was there. What he did find, however, was a trail of hoofprints in the snow, despite there being no animals in the yard. One evening, George discovered a hidden room in the basement, one not shown on any floor plans. The room was small, with blood-red walls and a foul stench that turned his stomach. He swore it hadn't been there before. Over time, the house's energy seemed to target George specifically. He began waking at 3:15 a.m. every night, the exact time the DeFeo murders had supposedly occurred. Despite the home's heating, George constantly felt cold. He grew irritable, unshaven, and obsessed with keeping the fire lit in the living room. His hygiene declined. His marriage suffered. He began to feel like something inside the house was trying to take him over. Meanwhile, the children began sleeping on their stomachs, a disturbing echo of how the DeFeo bodies were found. Black mold spread across their belongings, and green slime oozed from the walls. Doors slammed. Windows jammed open or shut. The banister on the stairs tore off completely, and the cabinet doors were ripped from their hinges. One night, George claimed to have been thrown from his bed by an unseen force. He watched, paralyzed, as Kathy levitated off the mattress. Her face morphed into that of a shriveled old woman before returning to normal. She remembered nothing. What happened next remains unknown. George and Kathy never fully revealed what occurred during their final night in the house. Whatever it was, it convinced them to flee immediately. They left everything: clothes, furniture, food in the fridge, even George's custom motorcycle in the garage. They never returned. Their story became the subject of Jay Anson's best-selling 1977 book, The Amityville Horror, which sold millions of copies and inspired dozens of film adaptations and documentaries. The world was hooked and terrified. But not everyone believed the version of events. The contradictions, exaggerations, and lack of physical evidence raised eyebrows. And over the decades, the cracks in the Lutz story widened. Were they truly haunted, or had they created the greatest paranormal hoax of the 20th century? Cracks in the story. For a while, the Lutz family's story seemed airtight. They had fled in terror, refused to return, and passed polygraph tests regarding their experiences. Jay Anson's best-selling book portrayed them as an ordinary family caught in a supernatural nightmare. But as the story gained fame, journalists, skeptics, and investigators began to dig, and what they found began to cast serious doubt on the legend of the Amityville Horror. The first and perhaps most significant crack came from Father Ray Pecoraro, the priest who had allegedly been slapped and ordered out of the house by a demonic voice. In early interviews in the Anson book, George Lutz stated that Father Pecoraro had blessed the house in person. But under legal pressure years later, the priest submitted an affidavit stating that he had never stepped foot in 112 Ocean Avenue. He said he had spoken to George on the phone, but that was it. No slap, no voice, no boils, just a phone call. Then came the issue of the mysterious red-eyed pig named Jody. George and Kathy claimed to have seen glowing eyes staring through the windows, and even hoofprints in the snow afterward. But according to local weather reports, there was no snowfall in Amityville on the night in question. No snow, no hoofprints, and possibly no Jody. Other details started to unravel too. The Red Room, the hidden space George found in the basement with crimson walls and a pungent smell, was supposedly not on the floor plans. It sounded terrifying. But when the next family moved in, they found the so-called Red Room with no trouble. It was simply a small storage area under the stairs, nothing more than a painted closet.
This is the Red Room. Nothing more than a storage area where Allison and her brothers and I used to keep toys.
And then there were the physical damages. The Lutzes claimed the front door was blown off its hinges, the banister torn off the stairs, and a heavy window smashed a child's fingers. But the new homeowners, Jim and Barbara Cromartie, who bought the house shortly after the Lutzes fled, reported that the house was in pristine condition. No broken door, no missing banister. The windows worked just fine. This raised a pressing question. If the house had experienced such violent supernatural forces, how had it seemingly repaired itself overnight? Reporters began connecting the dots, and skeptics dug even deeper. Perhaps the most controversial revelation came from William Weber, Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s defense attorney. Weber admitted that he had met with the Lutzes shortly after they fled the home, and that they had discussed ways to profit from the DeFeo murders. In one interview, he said, "We created this horror story over many bottles of wine." That statement rocked the public. Suddenly, the narrative of a haunted family began to look more like a marketing plan. And yet, the Lutzes held firm. They insisted that something real had happened to them. George, especially, refused to alter his story. When he was accused of fabricating the whole thing for financial gain, he calmly pointed out that the profits from the book and film had been relatively modest compared to the cultural impact. "If we were in it for money," he once said, "we failed." Still, other discrepancies piled up. In their original interviews, the Lutzes described green slime oozing from the walls, but there were no photos, no evidence. Later film adaptations portrayed black sludge and flying demons, all of which were fictionalized embellishments. Then came the issue of the windows. The Lutzes said one slammed shut on its own and crushed their son's fingers. The Cromarties, however, found all the window frames to be solid, with no damage or faulty mechanisms. Experts later attributed the original claim to a faulty window counterweight, or perhaps to nothing at all. One of the most iconic paranormal pieces of evidence, the photo of a young boy with glowing eyes captured during a psychic investigation, was also questioned. Some believed it showed the ghost of one of the DeFeo children, but others suggested it was simply a crew member or child visitor to the house that night, with light reflecting off his glasses. No one has ever proven its authenticity. Even Ed and Lorraine Warren, the famed paranormal investigators brought in to validate the haunting faced scrutiny. Critics pointed out that many of their most famous cases, including the Amityville Horror, the Perron haunting, which inspired The Conjuring, and the Enfield poltergeist, had similar patterns: frightened families, fantastic claims, and very little verifiable evidence. By the early 1980s, the legend of Amityville was in jeopardy. Lawsuits flew. Skeptics published entire books debunking the Lutzes story. The press began labeling it a hoax. And yet, the mystery persisted. Why would a family abandon their home, leave their possessions, and never return if it was all a lie? Were they swept up in fear and trauma from living in a murder house? Did they genuinely experience something unexplainable? Or was the whole story a priest's slap, demonic pigs, levitating wives, a carefully orchestrated fiction designed to sell books? A sinister alternate theory. By the early 1980s, as the Lutzes' paranormal claims came under fire, another thread began to gain traction, one that had less to do with ghosts and more to do with a human conspiracy, fueled by jealousy, rage, and possibly something even darker. It questioned everything we thought we knew about the DeFeo murders. What if Ronald "Butch" DeFeo Jr. didn't act alone? For years, Butch told different versions of the story. In one, he confessed to the murders in a drug-induced haze, saying he just snapped. In another, he claimed to have been possessed or guided by voices, an excuse later used in the original film adaptation. But in later interviews from prison, his story took a more sinister turn. Butch began to insist that his sister Dawn had played a key role in the murders. According to him, the plan was originally to kill only their parents. The siblings, Butch claimed, had grown tired of their father's abuse, verbal, physical, and controlling. Their mother, he said, had allowed it to continue for years. Butch painted himself and Dawn as allies in rebellion. On the night of November 13th, after watching the war film Castle Keep in the basement, he claimed the two agreed to act. He shot their parents, he admitted. But Dawn, he said, went rogue. While he was in another room, she allegedly took the rifle and killed their younger siblings. Butch claimed that when he discovered what she'd done, he became enraged and turned the gun on her, shooting her in the head. It sounds like a self-serving revision, but some forensic details raised eyebrows. Dawn's autopsy revealed unburned gunpowder on her nightgown, a sign she may have fired a weapon that night. There was no evidence of a struggle in her room, and the trajectory of the bullet in her head didn't perfectly match the others. Could she have been awake? Could she have participated? One of the most compelling theories is that the DeFeo children were subjected to extreme control and psychological abuse, particularly Butch. Some criminologists argue that years of manipulation, trauma, and drug abuse created a volatile personality primed to explode, and when that moment came, it wasn't random. It was years in the making. Could the paranormal activity described by the Lutzes have been an echo of that trauma? Psychologists argue that spaces tied to emotional violence can trigger psychological reactions in new occupants, especially those already stressed or suggestible. Perhaps the house wasn't haunted by spirits, but by the raw residue of fear, pain, and rage left behind. And as we now know, those contradictions didn't end with the murders. They carried into the haunting, into the book, into the films, and into the very legacy of Amityville itself. The truth revealed. As the Lutzes' haunting tale began to unravel under scrutiny, attention quietly shifted back to the real horror that birthed the legend, the brutal slaying of the DeFeo family in 1974. And what emerged was a far darker, more human possibility, one not of ghosts, but of conspiracy, betrayal, and an unspoken family secret. Ronald "Butch" DeFeo Jr. was convicted of murdering his entire family, but his story never stayed the same. In one version, he claimed demonic voices ordered him to kill. In another, he said he was in a drug-induced fog. But later, while in prison, he introduced a shocking twist. His sister Dawn had helped him. According to Butch, they had planned only to kill their abusive parents. But when he left the room, Dawn allegedly killed their siblings too, acting alone and impulsively. Enraged, he claimed he then shot her in retaliation. As outlandish as this sounds, certain details raised questions. Dawn's body bore unburned gunpowder, possibly indicating she had fired a weapon. Her wounds differed slightly from the others. Could she have played a role in the massacre, or was Butch simply rewriting history to ease his guilt? He didn't stop there. In other versions, he said 2 friends were in the house that night. He hinted at mafia connections and even claimed that his grandfather told him to stay quiet and let the family handle it. The DeFeos were rumored to be tied to organized crime, which might explain both the silence from neighbors and the clean, almost ritualistic nature of the murders. It also raises a question no one wants to ask. Was the case rushed through the courts to protect secrets? Then there was the cryptic comment from Ronald Sr., just months before his death. After returning from Montreal with religious statues and a priest rumored to be an exorcist, he reportedly said, "I've got a devil on my back." What did he mean? Was he talking about his son, his past, or something darker he believed lived in that house? Regardless of the truth, the pain and violence of that night lingered, and it's possible the Lutzes, already aware of the house's grim history, walked into a place where trauma hung thick in the air, where emotional residue turned ordinary creaks and shadows into something terrifying. Maybe there were no ghosts, maybe the house was never haunted, or maybe, just maybe, it was haunted, but not by demons. Perhaps places hold on to pain, perhaps homes remember. After all, if walls could speak, what would yours say? Do you believe a house can hold on to energy, especially the energy of fear, violence, and sorrow? Share your thoughts in the description below. That's all from us today. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.